They had cleared the front room for the wake, and the casket sat where the piano used to be. Ruth Voss had been married to Harlan for 52 years, and in all that time she had never once seen a room this quiet with a dog in it. Cinder lay under the casket stand, chin flat on the carpet, and had not moved in 3 days. Ruth had tried everything a person tries. She had set a bowl of water within reach of the dog's nose. She had brought the good blanket down from the closet, the one Harlan used to lay across the truck seat on cold mornings, and tucked it under Cinder's front paws. She had knelt on the floor, her knees complaining the way they always did now, and told the dog it was all right, that nobody was going anywhere, though she knew even as she said it that this was exactly the lie the dog would not believe. Neighbors came through in low shoes and lower voices. They looked at the flowers, they looked at Harlan in his good uniform jacket, and then, without fail, their eyes drifted down to the shepherd lying under the stand, and their eyes went wide, their voices catching mid-sentence. Nobody asked about the dog out loud. They just glanced at Ruth as if she might explain it, and she never did, because she didn't know how. The funeral director had called twice, the second time gently suggesting the dog be moved during viewing hours. Ruth thanked him and did nothing at all because she understood something he did not. Cinder was not confused. Cinder was not grieving in the shapeless way a dog grieves an owner it has simply lost. Cinder was waiting. She had the stillness of an animal that has been given a command and intends to hold her post until it is countermanded, and no one in the house had the authority to countermand it because no one in the house knew what the command had been. On the third night, unable to sleep, Ruth went looking through Harlan's phone for numbers she needed, the man from the Veterans Association, his old sergeant from 2 reunions back, the name of the fellow who used to help him with the truck. She scrolled slowly, the small light of the screen, the only light in the kitchen, and that was when she found it. A voice memo, 4 months old, saved under no name at all, just a string of numbers and a length, 51 seconds. She almost deleted it without listening. Harlan had a habit of recording himself notes and forgetting about them, grocery lists, half-remembered addresses, once an entire limerick about a fishing trip that had embarrassed him for a week after she found it. She nearly swiped it away with the rest. Something stopped her thumb an inch above the screen. She pressed play instead. His voice was thinner than she remembered, and that alone nearly undid her, because it meant he had already been sick when he recorded it, already further along than either of them had let themselves say out loud. There was a pause, the kind he always took before he said something he'd been rehearsing. "Ruth, if you're hearing this, I didn't get around to saying it out loud, so I'm saying it now. Take Cinder to my father's grave before you bury me. Don't ask her whether she wants to go. She already knows the way." That was all. 51 seconds, and then the recording ended on the small click of him setting the phone down, as if he'd meant to say more and thought better of it, or run out of whatever strength it had taken to say even that much. Ruth sat at the kitchen table for a long time, with the phone dark in her hand. She thought of Harlan's father, a man she had met exactly twice, both times briefly, both times decades ago, a man whose grave, as far as she knew, existed somewhere in a military cemetery 2 counties over, marked and settled and finished the way graves were supposed to be. She had no idea why Harlan would leave such a message with his very last recorded breath in that voice, no idea why a dog would need to be taken anywhere at all, and no idea, sitting there in the dark with the refrigerator humming behind her, what she was going to say to Mark when he asked her, and he would ask, first thing, the way he asked about everything now, what exactly she thought she was doing. She looked down the hallway to where Cinder still lay beneath the casket stand, eyes open, watching nothing, waiting for something specific. Ruth set the phone face down on the table, walked to the hook by the back door, and took down the leash, 3 days unused, and hung it where the dog would see it first thing in the morning. Morning came the color of dishwater, and Ruth called the Veterans Cemetery office before she had finished her first cup of coffee, because she was afraid that if she waited any longer she would talk herself out of it. The man who answered had a kind, tired voice, the voice of someone who fielded calls like hers every day of the week. She gave him the name, Elias Voss, Died sometime in the 1970s. She wasn't certain of the exact year. Her husband would have known, and she heard the soft clatter of a keyboard on the other end. Then a pause that went on a beat too long. "I'm showing a partial match," the man said. "Give me a little time to run it down properly. Records from that era, some of them are still catching up to the database. I'll call you back." Ruth thanked him and hung up and told herself that a partial match was not nothing. It was, she decided, standing at the counter with her coffee gone cold. Actually rather a lot, a thread, at least, where yesterday there had been none. She found Mark at the dining table with the funeral home's paperwork spread in front of him, the flower order, the guest book, the little card with the times printed on it for tomorrow's service. He had inherited his father's habit of doing hard things by making a list first. She watched him check something off and thought, not for the first time, how much he looked like Harlan had at that age. The same set to the jaw, the same way of holding a pen like it might get away from him. "I found something on Dad's phone," she said, and told him about the recording. She kept her voice even, the way she had learned to keep it even over 52 years of delivering news a man might not want. Mark set the pen down. He didn't ask her to play it. He didn't ask what Harlan's exact words had been. He was quiet longer than the moment called for, long enough that Ruth almost filled the silence herself, and when he finally spoke, his voice had a careful, level quality she didn't like. "Mom," he looked at the paperwork instead of at her. "Are you sure that's what he meant? Sure enough to build something out of it, this week?" It was a small question. On its face it was even a reasonable one, the kind of thing any son might ask a mother 2 days before a funeral, when she announces a plan involving a cemetery 2 counties away and a grave nobody had visited in longer than either of them could remember. But there was something underneath it, a weight Ruth couldn't name yet, though she felt her own shoulders tighten before she understood why. "I'm sure of what I heard, Mark. That's not quite what I asked." He said it gently. He always said things gently. It had never once made them easier to hear. She let it go, because there was too much else that day. The flowers, the guest book, the neighbor bringing a casserole nobody would eat, and because some part of her did not yet want to know why her son's face had gone so carefully blank at the mention of his own grandfather's name. The day filled itself in the way the days before a funeral always did, one small task swallowing the next until there was no room left to sit with anything longer than a minute or two. Ruth answered the door for deliveries she hadn't ordered and thank you calls she didn't remember owing, signed forms whose language she barely registered, and twice caught herself standing in the middle of a room with no memory of what she'd walked in to do. Grief did that, she remembered from her own parents passing decades ago, hollowed out the ordinary machinery of a day and left a person moving through motions built by habit alone. In the afternoon she took Cinder's leash down from the hook by the back door, more out of habit than hope, thinking she might get the dog to stand long enough to use the yard. She clipped it to the collar without much expectation, but the moment the leash's small metal clasp clicked into place, Cinder's ears came up, and for the first time in 3 days the dog rose to her feet, not eagerly, not the way a young dog might, but with the deliberate, weight-shifting care of an animal that has decided something is finally about to happen and means to be ready for it. Ruth stood very still in the hallway, leash slack in her hand, and looked down at a dog who had refused food, water, and comfort for 3 straight days, now standing at attention over a leash clip. "You understand something I don't," she said quietly, and the dog looked back at her with an expression Ruth would have called patient if it belonged to a person. The call came back just before 5, while Ruth was rinsing the casserole dish the neighbor had brought. It was the same man from the cemetery office, and his voice had lost some of its earlier warmth, not unkind, just careful, the voice of someone about to say something he'd rather not have to. "Mrs. Voss, I found the record. Elias Voss, correct dates, correct branch." A pause, the sound of paper being set down. "The trouble is the plot assignment. He's listed in what we call the unresolved section. It's an older part of the grounds, from a records reconciliation a long time back. The marker rows out there are numbered instead of named. I can give you the section, but I can't hand you a plot number that actually corresponds to a headstone with his name on it. I'm sorry, I know that's not what you wanted to hear." Ruth stood at the sink with the water still running, the dish towel forgotten in her other hand, and looked out the window at the dog now sitting patiently by the back door, leash still clipped, waiting for whatever came next. "Thank you for looking," she said, because there was nothing else to say yet, and hung up, and stood there a long moment before she called down the hallway for Mark, wanting to watch his face the instant she said the words out loud. The funeral was the next afternoon. The chapel was full. Harlan had been the kind of man who accumulated people over a lifetime without ever seeming to try. Old service buddies in pressed jackets, neighbors who had borrowed his ladder more times than they could count, a young corporal from the training program who stood at the back and would not meet anyone's eyes. Ruth stood through the service with Mark's hand under her elbow, and Cinder, allowed in at the funeral director's quiet and unusual concession, lay at the foot of the casket through the whole of it, motionless as she had been for days, while the chaplain spoke about faithful service and a life well spent. Ruth heard perhaps one word in 4. She was watching the dog. By the time it was over, cars lined the road outside the house for the reception that followed, and Ruth shook more hands than she could later remember, accepted more casseroles than her refrigerator could hold, and smiled the particular tired smile a person wears when grief has to share a room with hospitality. She was too worn by evening to say anything to anyone about unresolved sections and numbered rows. She let it sit until later that night, until the casserole dishes had been washed and returned to their owners, until the house had gone quiet, with the particular quiet of a home the day after it has hosted grief in public. She and Mark sat across from each other at the dining table, plates mostly untouched, and she told him what the cemetery office had said, the unresolved section, the numbered markers, no plot corresponding to a name. She had expected disappointment. She had expected, at most, mild concern about wasting her time on something that might not be solvable. She had not expected Mark to set down his fork so hard it rang against the plate, or for his voice to come out louder than either of them seemed to want it to. "Not now, Mom, not this week." He caught himself, brought it down half a register, but the sharpness stayed underneath. "You're burying Dad. You don't need to be driving out to some cemetery chasing down a grave from 50 years ago that nobody's visited since before I was born." It was his last request, Mark. It was a voice memo he probably recorded on a bad night and forgot about. He heard himself say it and flinched, just slightly, as if the words tasted wrong even as they left him. "I didn't mean it like that." "Then what did you mean?" He didn't answer right away. He looked down at his plate, at the food he hadn't eaten, and when he spoke again his voice had gone quiet in a different way, not gentle this time, but guarded. "I just don't want you chasing something that isn't going to give you what you're hoping for. I don't want you disappointed on top of everything else." It was, on its surface, a loving thing to say. Ruth had spent 52 years learning to hear the difference between what a man said and what a man meant. First with Harlan, and then, without quite realizing when the skill had transferred, with her son. And what she heard now, underneath the careful concern, was an answer that did not fit the question she had asked. She had asked him why he was reacting this strongly. He had answered with a reason to stop, a reason that sounded thoughtful and protective and true, and matched nothing about the tightness in his jaw or the way his eyes had gone somewhere else in the room. "Mark." She kept her voice level, the way she always did when something mattered too much to let it shake. "Why does this bother you so much?" "It doesn't bother me. He stopped, started again. "I just don't want you making this into more than it is." Into more than what exactly? A husband asking his wife to finish one small thing before he's buried. She heard her own voice sharpen and didn't try to soften it. "You've barely looked me in the eye since I mentioned that recording, Mark. I've known you your whole life. I know what you look like when you're worried about me, and I know what you look like when you're worried about something else entirely, and this is the second one." He opened his mouth, closed it again, and for a moment Ruth thought he might actually say whatever was sitting behind his eyes. Then the moment passed, the way it had passed twice already that week, and he only shook his head, as if disagreeing with something neither of them had said out loud. She looked at him a long moment. 52 years of marriage had taught her to recognize a door swinging shut before it finished closing, and this was that sound, unmistakable even though she couldn't yet see what was on the other side of it. Under the table, without warning, Cinder rose from where she'd been lying against Ruth's foot and pushed her way between the two chairs, inserting herself squarely between mother and son, her flank pressed against Ruth's leg, her head turned toward Mark, with a low, watchful stillness Ruth had only seen once before, the night a stranger's truck idled too long outside the house. It was simply presence, an animal placing herself, deliberately, in the space where the tension in the room had nowhere left to go. Nobody said anything for a moment. The dog's arrival had the strange effect of making the silence that followed heavier rather than lighter, as if even Cinder had felt Mark's shoulders drop and Ruth's jaw set, and had chosen to press in closer rather than move away. "I'm sorry," Mark said finally, standing, gathering his plate though he'd eaten almost nothing from it. "It's been a long week. I'm going to turn in." He didn't go to his old bedroom, the one he still used on visits home. Ruth heard his footsteps go the other way down the hall, toward the small room that had been his father's home office for 30 years and, for the last several, a kind of storage room nobody quite had the heart to clear out. She heard the door close. She had not heard that door close, she realized, sitting very still at the table, with the dog now leaning her full weight against her leg, since before Harlan got sick. Mark had not set foot in that room, as far as she knew, in longer than that. Months, maybe longer. She sat a while longer at the table that had not been cleared, one hand resting on Cinder's head, listening to the house settle around her, the refrigerator's hum, the tick of the hallway clock Harlan had never gotten quite level, and, faint through two closed doors, the sound of a drawer being opened and closed with more care than the hour called for. She did not know what was in that room. She did not know, sitting there, why a question about a grave from half a century ago had put that particular careful quiet into her son's hands. But something in her, the same something that had recognized, 3 nights ago, that a dog lying still under a casket stand was not confused but waiting, told her that whatever was behind that closed door had been waiting there for a very long time too, and that she had, without meaning to, just knocked on it for the first time. She thought about going down the hall and asking him outright. She got as far as pushing her chair back before she stopped herself, because some instinct older than the question told her this was not a door that would open to force, only to time, and she did not yet know how much of either she had left before the answer found its own way out. Cinder let out a long breath against her leg and did not move again for the rest of the night, and Ruth sat there with her hand on the dog's head, listening to the drawer in the far room open once more, and close and go still. Ruth did not ask Mark to come with her the next morning. She told herself it was because he had errands, the estate paperwork, calls to make about the house, all of it true, all of it convenient. She loaded Cinder into the back seat of the car, the leash coiled on the passenger floor, and drove the 2 counties out to the Veterans Cemetery without telling anyone where she was going. The drive took just under an hour, most of it on a 2-lane highway that ran past dairy farms gone quiet in the late season, and Ruth spent the time trying not to think about the closed office door and thinking about nothing else. Cinder rode with her chin resting on the top of the front seat, ears up, the same posture she'd held since the leash first clicked into place, an animal riding toward something, not away from it. She had left before Mark was awake, a note on the kitchen counter saying only that she had an errand and would be back by afternoon, which was true in the way a thing can be true and still feel like a small betrayal. She had never once, in 52 years, kept anything from Harlan that mattered, and here she was, 3 days a widow, already learning the shape of a secret in her own hand. It did not sit easily with her. She told herself it was temporary, that she would tell Mark everything the moment there was something worth telling, and tried not to notice how much that sounded like the very excuse he himself had been offering her all week. The cemetery grounds themselves stretched far wider than Ruth had pictured from the phone calls alone. Acre after acre of white stone under a flat autumn sky, the newer sections closest to the road bright and orderly, the older ones receding toward a distant tree line like the rings of some enormous, quiet tree. The cemetery office was a low brick building near the entrance, and the young woman behind the desk was polite and apologetic in roughly equal measure. She pulled up the file Ruth had been told about over the phone, turned the monitor slightly so Ruth could see, though the screen meant little to her beyond a column of numbers and a section code. "I can walk you out to the section," the woman offered. "I have to be honest with you though, there's no name marker out there. It's rows of numbered stones, the originals from that reconciliation. I'd still like to see it." They walked out together, past the newer sections with their bright white rows and legible names, past a scattering of visitors with flowers and folding chairs, until the ground sloped gently downward toward an older part of the grounds where the stones sat closer to the earth, weathered, each bearing nothing but a number and a small cross. Cinder, off-leash now at Ruth's quiet insistence, moved ahead of them both, nose low, working the ground the way Ruth had seen her work a search field years ago, back when Harlan still took her out for training on weekends, back when the dog had a job and did it without being told twice. "This whole section is documented as unoccupied by any linked record," the young woman was saying, half apologetic, half reciting something she'd said many times before. "It happens more than people think, from that era. Paper records, transfers between—" She stopped talking because Cinder had stopped walking. The dog had gone still 11 markers down the row, at a plain numbered stone indistinguishable, to Ruth's eye, from the 6 on either side of it. She sat, haunches settling into the grass with the same deliberate finality she'd shown 3 nights ago beneath the casket stand, and did not move, and did not look away from the stone in front of her. "That's," the young woman consulted her tablet, frowning, "that section's confirmed empty. No linked burial record at all. I'm sorry, I don't know what she's responding to." Ruth walked up slowly and stood beside the dog, looking down at the plain marker, at the number stamped into stone that meant nothing to her and, apparently, everything to Cinder. She crouched, the way her knees complained about these days, and put a hand flat against the dog's shoulder. "She's not wrong," Ruth said quietly, not quite to the young woman, not quite to herself. "She's never once been wrong about anything my husband taught her." The young woman didn't argue, but didn't agree either, just made a small note on her tablet and said she'd flag it for a supervisor, though her tone suggested this was a courtesy rather than a promise. Ruth understood. A confirmed empty section was, on paper, a fact. A dog sitting in front of 1 stone out of 200 was not evidence anyone in an office would act on. Ruth thanked her anyway, because the young woman had at least walked the ground with her, instead of simply reciting a database entry over the phone, and because some habits of courtesy outlast every other kind of patience a week like this one could wear down. She lingered a moment longer at the marker, memorizing its position relative to the tree line, the slight rise in the ground, the way the afternoon light fell across the number stamped into the stone, details that meant nothing to a records office and, she suspected, everything to the animal now leaning her full weight, at last, against Ruth's leg. But it was something. It was, Ruth thought, driving back with the windows cracked and Cinder once again resting her chin against the front seat, the first thing in 3 days that had not come from a piece of paper or a careful sentence designed to close a conversation rather than open one. She thought, on the drive home, of Denise Okafor. Denise had worked with Harlan decades ago, back when he still did occasional consulting for the service dog training program, and for a stretch of years after that had worked in records at the same regional archive office, the one that would have handled a transfer like Elias's, back when paper files still moved between filing cabinets instead of servers. Ruth hadn't spoken to her in years beyond a Christmas card, but she still had the number, tucked in the back of an address book, that had not been updated since long before either of them had learned to use a smartphone. She called from the kitchen that evening after Mark had gone out, to the hardware store, he'd said, though he'd been gone longer than a hardware store trip should take. Denise remembered her immediately, remembered Harlan with real warmth, offered condolences Ruth had heard 100 times that week and somehow still felt in this one. Ruth explained what she was looking for, a file, decades old, connected to Elias Voss, possibly never properly linked to a burial record. There was a pause on the line, the kind that told Ruth the question had landed somewhere specific rather than in the vague middle distance most questions about old paperwork landed in. Ruth pictured her, an ocean of gray filing cabinets somewhere behind her, doing the mental arithmetic of decades. There might be something, Denise said slowly. Some of the older physical files never got digitized when everything moved over. If there's still a paper original somewhere, it'd be in one of the archive boxes nobody's opened in years. I can ask around, see if anyone still has access to that storage. No promises, Ruth. It's been a long time. Anything you can find, I'd be grateful for. She thanked Denise again before hanging up, and sat a moment with the receiver still warm in her hand, thinking of how odd it was to be placing this much hope in a woman she hadn't spoken to in 3 years, over a stack of boxes neither of them had actually seen yet. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table a while, the address book still open in front of her, and thought about how strange it was that the two most useful things she'd found all week, a dog sitting still in front of an unmarked stone, and an old friend's half-remembered access to a storage room, had come from nowhere near the direction she'd expected help to come from. Not the office with the tablet and the polite apologies, not, so far, her own son. It was nearly 11 when she heard Mark's truck in the driveway, much later than any hardware store closing time would explain. She got up, meaning to ask him where he'd been, and caught sight of the light under the door of Harlan's old office as she passed down the hallway, on again, though she was certain she hadn't left it that way, the thin gold line at the bottom of the door the only sign that someone was awake and moving carefully behind it. She stood in the hallway a long moment, hand not quite raised to knock, and then let it fall back to her side. Whatever was in that room, she told herself, would still be there in the morning. She went to bed instead, and lay awake longer than she wanted to admit, listening for the door to open, and it never did, not until well after she had finally, against her own intention, fallen asleep. When she woke near dawn, stiff on top of the covers, the thin gold line under the office door was gone, and the hallway held the particular stillness of a room somebody had already left. Denise called back 2 days later, in the middle of the afternoon, and Ruth could tell from the first word of her hello that whatever she'd found had not been simple good news. "I found someone who remembers the file," Denise said. "Older fellow, retired now, but he worked storage back in the day and has a memory like nobody I've ever met. He says there was a paper original for Elias Voss, a full transfer record, the kind that would have cleared up exactly the mess you're dealing with now." A pause, the sound of Denise choosing her next words with more care than the sentence before it had needed. "He also says it went missing from the archive, not misfiled, not lost in a move, missing, sometime around 15 years ago, near as he can place it. No note on why, no record of it being checked out properly, just gone." Ruth sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the phone pressed hard against her ear, as if that might make the words land differently. "Gone how? Documents don't just walk out of a government archive, Denise. They're not supposed to, but this one did, and nobody ever filed a report on it, which is its own kind of strange, because normally a document like that missing would have kicked off a whole process. It's like it slipped out quiet enough that nobody upstairs ever noticed it, wasn't a normal loss." Ruth thanked her, meant it, and sat with the phone dark in her lap for a long time after the call ended, turning the word over. Missing, not lost, not misfiled, simply gone in the quiet way a thing goes missing when someone wants it to. She sat there long enough that the kitchen light outside had gone from afternoon gold to the flatter gray of early evening before she noticed, and long enough for Cinder to come find her, resting a heavy chin on her knee, as if the dog, too, understood that something in the house had just shifted weight. She spent the hour before dinner rehearsing how she would say it, the way she used to rehearse difficult conversations with Harlan decades ago, turning the words over until they sounded less like an accusation and more like simple fact, because she still did not want to believe there was any accusation buried in them at all. She told Mark that evening because she had promised herself she would keep nothing from him, even as some new and unfamiliar caution had crept into how she chose her words. She kept it simple. Denise had found someone who remembered the file. The file was gone, gone in a way that suggested it hadn't wandered off on its own. She watched his face while she said it, and she would spend the rest of that night trying to convince herself she had imagined what she saw there. But she hadn't imagined it. Mark's color went, not dramatically, not the stuff of any story anyone would believe if she tried to describe it later, just a shade paler around the mouth, a stillness that settled over him too fast to be simple surprise. "Don't dig any further into it," he said. He caught the strange formal note in his own voice and tried to soften it, tried again. I just think you've gotten enough out of this already. A missing file from 15 years ago, Mom. That's not something you're going to be able to run down. Let it go." 15 years ago you'd have just started college. She said it slowly, almost to herself, watching his face as she did. "You were younger than I've been thinking of you as, all week. What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing yet." She heard the strange honesty in her own answer, even as she said it. She genuinely did not yet know what it meant, only that some instinct had reached for the fact of his age that year and set it down on the table between them, like a card she wasn't sure how to play. Dig. It was the second time in a week he had used that exact word, and Ruth noticed it the way you notice a word repeated in a language you don't fully speak, not sure yet what it meant, only sure that it meant something, because no one used the same odd word twice by accident. "I'm not digging anywhere, Mark. I'm trying to finish what your father asked." She said it quietly, but firmly enough that it hung in the kitchen a moment before either of them moved past it, the way a dropped plate hangs in the air just before it breaks. I know you are." He rubbed a hand over his face, and for a moment he looked less like a man being evasive and more like a man exhausted by something Ruth couldn't see the shape of yet. "I just don't want this turning into something that hurts more people than it helps." She wanted to ask him what he meant by more people. She wanted to ask him, plainly, whether he knew something about that missing file that he hadn't said. But something in his face, not guilt exactly, something closer to dread, stopped the question in her throat, because some part of her understood that if she asked it directly, tonight, in this kitchen, with the dishes still in the sink, she might get an answer she was not ready to carry into tomorrow's plans. He went to bed early. She heard, later, the same careful sound from down the hall. A drawer, a pause, a drawer again, and this time she did not tell herself it would still be there in the morning. This time she lay awake a long while, staring at the ceiling in the dark, doing something she had never once let herself do in 52 years of being someone's wife and 30 years of being someone's mother. She let herself wonder, in plain terms, whether the person she trusted most in this house, after Harlan, the only person, might be keeping something from her large enough to explain all of it. The thought frightened her more than the missing file had. She lay there turning it over, and turned it too far, the way exhaustion and grief will do to even a careful mind, until she found herself suspecting shapes that made no sense, old rivalries in Harlan's unit, some grudge from the archive office itself, anyone, anything, rather than land on the one person the evidence kept quietly pointing toward. It was easier, that night, to distrust strangers she had never met than to let the suspicion settle where it actually belonged. She built, in the dark, an entire cast of possible culprits, a jealous colleague of Harlan's from decades back, a careless records clerk long since retired and unreachable even, absurdly, some vague notion of bureaucratic malice with no face and no name at all. Each one she constructed with more effort than the last, because each one required her to look somewhere other than down the hall, and by 3 in the morning she had exhausted nearly every possibility the world could reasonably offer her, except the single most obvious one, which she set down every time it rose in her, getting up from her own thoughts, to rinse a glass or straighten a chair, rather than sit with it a moment longer. She got up sometime after midnight, unable to lie there any longer, and went to sit in the dark kitchen with a glass of water she didn't really want, just for the company of the refrigerator's hum and something to hold in her hands. Cinder found her there within minutes, padding in from the hallway, nails clicking softly on the floor, and instead of continuing down toward Mark's closed door, the way she sometimes did on her nightly rounds of the house, she came directly to Ruth's chair and lay down against her feet, a solid, warm weight settling in for the night. In another week, in another version of this same house, it might have been such a small thing, a dog choosing a spot to sleep. Ruth told herself that, sitting there in the dark, told herself it meant nothing, that dogs went where the warmth was, where the person who'd fed them last happened to be sitting. But she did not entirely believe it, and some part of her, the part that had watched this same dog sit unmoving in front of one unmarked stone out of 200, understood that Cinder had never, in 9 years, needed a reason beyond instinct to know exactly where to be. She sat with her hand on the dog's head a long while, listening to the house tick and settle around her, until the water in the glass had gone warm and untouched, and did not go back to bed at all. Somewhere in the small hours she must have dozed sitting upright, because when she next opened her eyes the window over the sink had gone from black to the pale gray that comes just before actual light, and her neck ached from the angle of the chair. And in the morning, when she finally rose stiff from that same kitchen chair, she found that Mark had already left the house, earlier than his habit, earlier than any errand she knew of required, the driveway empty where his truck should have been, and no note this time, not even the kind that felt like a small betrayal. Ruth went back to the cemetery alone the next morning, and this time she didn't stop at the office. She didn't want another polite explanation about confirmed empty sections and unlinked records. She wanted to watch the dog work. She had slept perhaps 3 hours, and it showed in the way her hands moved on the steering wheel, a half-second slower than usual at every turn. But some clarity had come with the exhaustion too. Her eyes felt raw, and her hands unsteady, yet her mind had gone strangely clean, the way it does once a body finally stops fighting its own tiredness. She was not going to spend today asking anyone in an office for permission to believe what she already believed. She parked near the older section and let Cinder out of the car without the leash at all, standing back the way she used to stand back on the weekends decades ago when Harlan ran the dog through training exercises in the far field behind the house, before Ruth fully understood what any of it meant, back when it had just looked like play with very serious rules. Cinder didn't go to the numbered stone from 2 days before. Thinner now, her ribs starting to show beneath the coat, she moved past it slowly, nose low, working a patient arc that took her beyond the edge of the unresolved section entirely. Out past a low split-rail fence into a stretch of ground that didn't appear to be part of any organized section at all, unmowed at its margins, a scatter of older trees breaking up what would otherwise have been open field. She stopped beneath a wide old oak, its roots humped up through the grass, its canopy throwing shade in a broad circle, and lay down. Not sat, this time. Lay down fully, chin on paws, in the specific and total way she had lain beneath the casket stand 3 days that felt now like a much longer time ago. Ruth walked over slowly and stood at the edge of the oak's shade, looking down at nothing in particular: grass, exposed root, a patch of ground that held, as far as she could see, no marker of any kind, no number, no stone, nothing to distinguish it from any other quiet corner of unclaimed cemetery ground. She knelt anyway, the way her knees complained about but no longer stopped her from doing, and put her hand flat on the grass beside the dog. "All right," she said, out loud, to no one, to the dog, to the tree, to whatever was or wasn't beneath the ground in front of her. "I believe you." It occurred to her, saying it, how rarely she had spoken those exact words to anyone this past week, not to the young woman with the tablet, not even fully to Mark, and how strange it was that the easiest recipient of her trust, in the end, had turned out to be an animal who could not answer her back in any language she understood. She stayed there a long while. She did not fully understand, kneeling in the grass with her hand resting near a dog who had never once needed a map to find what Harlan had trained her to find, why this particular patch of earth beneath this particular tree should mean anything at all. She thought of Harlan out in the far field behind their old house, decades younger, running Cinder through drills with a patience Ruth had sometimes envied and sometimes resented, and understood, kneeling there, that whatever he had built into this animal over 9 years of quiet, deliberate work had outlasted him by exactly the number of days it needed to. But she had stopped, somewhere in the last 3 days, needing to understand a thing before she trusted it. She had needed to understand Mark's answers, and they had come back not matching the questions. She had needed to understand a missing file, and the not understanding of it had kept her up half the night suspecting the wrong people. Here, at least, there was no answer that failed to match the question, because the dog had never once tried to explain herself. She simply went where the truth was and lay down. The morning had a stillness to it that felt, to Ruth, almost ceremonial. No wind in the grass, no other visitors in sight, along the whole sloping stretch of ground. Just the two of them and the tree, and whatever lay beneath it, patient after 50 years of being nowhere at all. Ruth took out her phone, awkward with the unfamiliar motion, and marked the location as best the little map application allowed. A pin dropped near enough to the oak that she thought she could find it again, even without Cinder to guide her. She took several photographs, the tree from a few angles, the ground beneath it, the dog lying patient and certain in the shade, and, almost as an afterthought, a photograph of her own hand pressed flat against the grass, as if some part of her wanted proof, later, that she had actually been here, and actually knelt down, and actually believed what she was looking at. Then she called the cemetery office and asked for the young woman from 2 days before by name, and explained, as plainly and calmly as she could manage, that she had a specific location she would like cross-referenced against any record at all, however old, however improperly filed, connected to a unit transfer or a records reconciliation from decades back. She gave the coordinates as best she understood them. The young woman, to her credit, did not dismiss it outright this time. Something in Ruth's voice, or perhaps simply the specificity of an actual location rather than a vague hope, seemed to earn a different kind of attention. "I'll flag it for the survey team," the woman said. "I can't promise how soon, but I'll push to get someone out there. I'll make sure it gets looked at." Ruth thanked her and hung up, and stood a moment longer beneath the oak, with the late morning light coming down soft and broken through the branches, and thought about how long an unpromised wait could stretch, with the funeral behind them now and every formality of the estate beginning its slow, grinding march toward completion, with a dog who had eaten almost nothing in nearly a week and grown visibly thinner beneath her coat, with a son who had left the house that morning, earlier than any errand of his required, and hadn't said where he was going. She loaded Cinder back into the car, and the dog went willingly this time, without the reluctance of the drive out, as if some part of the job had, for now, been finished. The finding had been done. Whatever came next belonged to other hands. The drive back felt shorter than the drive out, the way a road always does once you know what waits at the far end of it. They were halfway home, the two-lane highway unspooling past the same quiet dairy farms, when Ruth's phone buzzed in the cup holder where she'd left it. She glanced down at a stoplight and saw Mark's name on the screen. Not a text, an actual call, the first time he had called her, rather than simply been present in the house since the night of that first hard conversation at the dining table. 4 days, and what felt like a much longer distance ago. She let it ring twice before she answered, bracing herself without quite knowing for what, and when she finally picked up, her son's voice on the other end sounded different than it had in days, quieter, and something else beneath the quiet that she couldn't name until she heard the next thing he said. "Mom, can you meet me at the house? I need to tell you something, and I don't want to say it over the phone." She drove the rest of the way home, with her heart doing something unfamiliar and uneven in her chest, running through every version of what he might be about to say, none of which prepared her for the one she was actually about to hear. He was waiting on the porch when she pulled into the driveway, not in the kitchen, not in the dining room where their hardest conversation of the week had already happened once. He was sitting on the top step in the late afternoon light, elbows on his knees, and he looked, Ruth thought as she got out of the car and let Cinder out behind her, like a much younger man than 52, like the boy who used to sit on that same step, waiting to confess some smaller failure, a broken window, a failing grade, back before either of them had any idea what a real failure might one day cost. She sat down beside him without a word, and Cinder settled at their feet, between them, the way she had wedged herself between their chairs at the dining table days before, except this time there was no argument for her to break up, only a silence Ruth didn't yet know the weight of. 15 years ago, Mark said, and stopped, and started again. 15 years ago, I was working a summer at the regional archive, doing digitization work before I went back to finish my degree. You remember? Boxes and boxes of old paper files, and half of us barely knew what we were doing, moving as fast as they told us to move because they wanted the backlog cleared before the funding ran out. Ruth said nothing at all. She had learned, this past week, in a kitchen and a dining room, and now on this porch step, that silence sometimes did more work than any question she could have asked. I was going through a box of old transfer records, service member burials, reassignments between cemetery sections, the kind of paperwork that used to get shuffled around for decades before anyone digitized it properly. Grandpa Elias's file was in that box. He said it plainly, the way a man says a thing he has rehearsed so many times in his own head that the rehearsal has worn all the drama out of it, leaving only the bare fact. I dropped it. Not the whole box, just that one folder, out of a stack I was carrying too fast because I was behind schedule and didn't want to get chewed out again. It went into a bin of paper that was already marked for shredding that afternoon. I didn't realize until the next morning what I'd done, and by then it was gone, actually gone, shredded with 100 other things nobody needed anymore. He rubbed his hands together slowly, looking not at Ruth, but out at the yard, at nothing. For a moment he seemed 19 again in truth, not just in the shape of the memory, his shoulders drawn in the way they used to draw in whenever Harlan caught him at something small and foolish, back before either of them knew how much heavier a grown man's mistakes could get. I should have reported it. There was a process. You were supposed to flag any documentation error immediately, and it probably wouldn't have even been that serious, honestly, in the scheme of things that went wrong in that office. But I was 19, and I'd already been written up once that summer for being careless, and I was terrified they were going to fire me, and Dad, his voice caught just slightly on the word, Dad had gotten me that job through a friend of his. I was so afraid of him finding out I'd been careless with his own father's file that I just didn't say anything. Those nights this week, when you heard me in his old office, I wasn't hiding anything in there. I was just standing at that desk, opening the same empty drawer over and over, trying to work up the nerve to walk out and tell you. I told myself it probably didn't matter. I told myself the burial record itself was probably fine somewhere else, that the transfer paperwork was just a formality, a copy. I told myself that for 15 years, Mom. I told myself it so many times I almost believed it. Ruth sat very still, feeling something break loose inside her chest, grief for the boy who had carried this alone, tangled tight with a fierce aching relief, the particular ache of watching a person she loved finally set down a weight she hadn't known he was carrying. "That's why you didn't want me looking," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. She said it the way a person names a shape they have been staring at in the dark for days, relieved, finally, simply to have the word for it. "That's why." He finally looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything more, the whole week compressed into that one held look between them, the dining table, the closed office door, the drawer opening and closing in the dark. "It was never that I thought it was pointless, Mom. It was never that I didn't care about Grandpa. I panicked the second you mentioned that recording, because I knew exactly why there wouldn't be a clean record waiting for you at the end of it. I knew it was going to lead back to a mistake I made when I was 19 years old and never had the courage to admit. And every single day this week, watching you get a little closer, I kept thinking, if I just say stop now, if I just convince her it's not worth it, maybe nobody has to know it was me." He shook his head slowly. "That's a rotten thing to want, when the person you're protecting yourself from is your own mother, in the same week you buried your own father." Ruth reached over and took his hand, the way she used to when he was small and had confessed some much smaller thing on this same porch step, and found she could not immediately speak because there was too much in her at once. Relief that the suspicion she'd carried in the dark kitchen 2 nights ago had a shape at last, however painful, something close to grief for the 19-year-old boy who had carried this alone for 15 years without ever once setting it down. And beneath all of it, quiet and steady, plain gratitude, because whatever this cost him to say, it was finally the truth, and the truth, however it landed, was better than the careful, mismatched answers she'd been getting all week. "I wish you'd told me years ago," she said finally. "Not because I'd have been angry, because you didn't have to carry it alone for 15 years. I know that now." His voice was rough. "I don't think I knew it then. I think I was so sure that admitting it would cost me something I couldn't get back, your trust, his respect, some version of myself I still wanted to believe in, that it never once occurred to me the silence itself might cost more. Yeah, it did, Ruth said gently, but it's done costing now, if you let it be. Cinder, who had lain quietly between their feet through the whole of it, chose that moment to rise, shift her weight, and settle her head against Mark's knee, the first time in 9 years, as far as either of them could recall, that the dog had chosen him over anyone else in a room. Mark went very still, one hand coming down slowly to rest on her head, and something in his shoulders, some tension Ruth had watched him carry since the night of the dining table argument, finally began to ease. "She's not judging you," Ruth said softly, watching them both. "She never does. That's the whole trick of her, I think. Your father used to say a good dog doesn't hold anything against you that you've already stopped doing." They sat there a while longer, as the light went from gold to something dimmer, none of them in a hurry to move, the porch step holding all three of them the way it had held Mark alone so many times as a boy. Back when the failures were smaller and the forgiveness came easier, and Ruth found herself thinking that perhaps it still could, that the size of the mistake had never really been the thing standing between them, only the size of the silence around it. Finally Mark drew a long breath, straightened, and looked at his mother with an expression she hadn't seen on him in longer than she could remember, something unguarded, something ready. "I'll call the cemetery office in the morning," he said. "I'll tell them what I just told you, about the file, about how it actually went missing. It might not fix anything on its own, but combined with whatever you found out there with her," he nodded down at Cinder, "it might be enough to get someone to actually walk that ground and take it seriously." He paused. "I don't want you making that call alone anymore. Whatever happens next, we do it together, both of us." Ruth looked at her son for a long moment, at the dog resting against his knee, at the porch step where he had once confessed so many smaller things over so many smaller years, and felt something in her own chest settle for the first time in days into something that was almost, though not quite yet, peace. They went together the next morning, mother and son, in Mark's truck this time, with Cinder riding between them on the bench seat the way she used to ride with Harlan on his errands, chin resting first on Ruth's shoulder, then Mark's, as if she couldn't decide yet whom she belonged to and had settled instead on belonging to both. Neither of them said much on the drive. There was nothing left that needed rehearsing. The truth had already been spoken once, on the porch, and today's task was simply to say it again in a room with the authority to act on it. The young woman at the cemetery office had a supervisor with her this time, an older man in a windbreaker who introduced himself briefly and got straight to business, laying a topographic map of the grounds flat on the counter. Mark told his part first, plainly, without flinching, the same account he'd given on the porch step the evening before, the dropped folder, the bin marked for shredding, the 15 years of silence. The supervisor listened without interrupting, made a few notes, and then pulled up the coordinates Ruth had called in 2 days earlier. "We had a survey team out there yesterday afternoon, following up on your call," he said, turning the map so Ruth could see. "Ground-penetrating equipment. There's an unmarked interment, consistent with the period and the unit records we do have, and given what your sons just told us, that fills in exactly the gap we couldn't otherwise explain. I'd call this confirmed, pending the formal paperwork, which given the circumstances shouldn't take terribly long." Ruth felt her breath leave her all at once, relief first, and beneath it something larger and harder to name, 6 days of bracing finally allowed to let go. They drove straight from the office to the ground beneath the oak, the survey team's small orange flags still marking the perimeter of what the equipment had found. Cinder was out of the truck before it had fully stopped, moving eagerly if stiffly, thinner than she'd been all week but steady on her feet, straight past the flags, to the exact spot beneath the tree where she had lain 3 days before, and settled there again, not searching this time, not working, simply resting, the way an animal rests when a job is finally, completely done. Mark knelt beside her in the grass, one hand coming to rest on her back, and after a moment he reached his other hand up to Ruth's shoulder, still kneeling, so that for a moment all three of them, the old dog, the son, and the mother standing above them both with her hand coming down to cover his, were joined in the same patch of shade, beneath the same old tree that had kept a 50-year secret and finally given it up. Nobody said anything grand. Ruth had half expected, somewhere in the drive over, that this moment would call for words, for some accounting of everything the week had cost, and everything it had finally repaired. But kneeling there in the grass with her son and her husband's dog, she found there was nothing that needed saying, that the three of them together weren't already saying without a word. She thought, kneeling there, of the recording still saved on Harlan's phone, of a voice grown thin, saying she already knows the way. He had asked her to do this before he was buried, and she hadn't managed that. The funeral had come and gone, with the grave still lost. But kneeling here now, she understood that a promise didn't expire just because its deadline had already passed. It only waited, the same way Cinder had waited, for someone to finish it anyway. Not simply that the dog would find the ground, but that the dog would, in finding it, find a way to bring the rest of them back together too. They stayed a long while, the light shifting through the branches above them, until finally Mark stood, brushed the grass from his knees, and helped his mother up beside him. Neither of them moved to leave. Cinder stayed exactly where she was, and neither of them tried to move her either. It was the cemetery office manager, catching up to them a little out of breath a few minutes later, with the paperwork already partially filled out, who asked the question that finally gave the moment its shape. "We'll need a date for the new marker," he said, glancing between them. "For the inscription, is there a particular day you'd like it to reflect? The original service date? Or today? Or—" Ruth looked at Mark. Mark looked back at her, and something passed between them that needed no further discussion, the first thing all week they had agreed on instantly and completely. "Today," they said, together, at almost exactly the same moment, and then looked at each other, and for the first time since before the funeral, allowed themselves something close to a smile. The manager nodded, made the note, and told them the new stone would likely be ready within the week, a proper marker this time, name and dates and unit, set where the old numbered stone had never quite managed to be, in the place beneath the oak where a dog had known the truth all along, and simply waited, with more patience than either of the humans standing beside her, for someone to finally believe her enough to look. A week later they came back to set the new marker in place beneath the oak. It was small, clean, correct. A name, 2 dates, a unit, everything the old numbered stone had never been allowed to say. Cinder found a patch of sunlight breaking through the branches just beside it, and lay down in the warmth, the way a dog lies down when it has finally, fully stopped waiting. Ruth and Mark sat together on the grass a little apart from the stone, not saying much, watching the light move slowly across the dog's coat. There was nothing left to solve between them. There was nothing left to hide. After a while, quietly, without meaning it as any kind of announcement, Ruth said her husband's name out loud, just his name, into the afternoon air, and found, for the first time in 9 days, that it came out whole, without catching in her throat on the way.